Good evening, guys. It is Thursday, April 17th, 2025. This Bathrobe business got my coffee and I got the news. So let's jump into it. A number of stories I'm going to talk about, but I'm actually going to start kind of with the lead today because it was kind of the finisher from yesterday. So I want to talk about Vietnam tariffs and American industrial policy. So we'll call that the overarching theme. So before I jump into the articles from yesterday, I want to present one article from today that just shows how much the trade war is really ramping up. So we can see that the trade war isn't just rhetoric. It's pretty much come to an absolute, all-out war at this point. Xi has taken his position, Trump has taken his position, and they're just hurling stuff at each other at this point. Another thing came down from the Trump administration today. Let me share this article. So the Trump administration announced fees on Chinese ships docking at U.S. ports. So this yesterday we talked about how ships were essentially being blocked from coming into the United States. Not essentially, but there were a bunch of orders being canceled because the tariffs were just simply too high coming from China. So there's all these freight ships that just aren't getting orders and are kind of being turned around and left in the middle of the ocean right now because the tariffs are just simply too high. Well, now the Trump administration has handed down that any Chinese-built ships that are docking in American ports are going to pay major fees. These fees are based essentially on tonnage. So, for example, it goes as high as effective April 17th, a fee in the amount of $140 per ton for the arrival of a vessel. And these ships are sometimes 220 tons. So you're talking about millions of dollars essentially in fees for these ships coming into the United States, in addition to existing tariffs. And even if the tariffs on there aren't coming from China, these are just Chinese ships. So even if China built this ship and it's being used by Europe, by France, the goods coming from there will still be hit with these fees because it's a Chinese vessel. So yeah, definitely ramping up and getting more and more toxic by the day. Now, about what I wanted to talk about from yesterday. I want to talk about Vietnam and American trade policy. So to preface this, a lot of the issues with the Trump administration have been that they have this aggressive tariff policy. They have this policy of America first, rebuilding America, etc. But there's no actual industrial policy. An example of a good industrial, well, I guess good is relative, but an example of an industrial policy is what happened during the Biden administration with the CHIPS Act, right? Joe Biden passed an act where we want to manufacture chips in the United States. He set aside money, funds, etc. There was also some broadband stuff that he set aside as well as part of that. I think it wasn't directly, but it was indirectly part of the CHIPS Act. And those that wanted to take advantage of it could. And so therefore it gave tax incentive and gave money to industries that are manufacturing chips in the United States. Us here in Utah, Texas Instruments took advantage of that. I think they're expanding their facility to like $8 billion, by $8 billion, expanding to more microchip manufacturing here in Lehi, Utah, just about 20 minutes south of where I am. That's an industrial policy. Now, the Trump administration has not come out with anything like that. Not to say that the Biden administration's policy was successful, but the Trump administration hasn't come out with anything so far. Technically, you don't need industrial policy. You technically don't. Now, I say this with a libertarian mindset because I do have a pretty strong libertarian streak within me. I'm a libertarian based on normie standards, based off of libertarian standards. I'm probably a left-wing socialist, but there is something to be said about the invisible hand of the market, that the United States doesn't need a direct industrial policy. It doesn't need to pick winners and losers. It just needs to kind of let the market work itself out and have those industries develop naturally in the United States when there's now guardrails protecting the United States industry from attacks from the outside. That's the theory. That's great in theory. But that's not actually a libertarian argument, because one of the problems with the invisible hand is that it has to be unshackled. And the United States does not have that. The United States, in order to allow the invisible hand of the free market to go to work, has to release a ton of regulation and a ton of financial regulation that would let capital flow in order for industry to really thrive. So what I mean by that, if I wanted to produce these mouses, Iron Man, of course, because you got to keep it real. If I wanted to produce this mouse from, let's say, not quite scratch, but as close to it as we can. I want to build the Wi-Fi antenna. I want to build the USB antenna. I want to do everything. There's a ton of regulation I would have to go through. There's a ton of tax policy I would have to go through. There's a ton of capital expenditures I would need. I would need good financial markets so that I could go out and borrow from the free market. A lot of that comes with existing infrastructure that is a regulatory hurdle that is very difficult to clear. So, for example, during the Biden administration, our company applied for an SBA loan. We have a proven track record. We're a growing, thriving business. We could not secure this loan. There was just simply too much regulatory hurdle. Now, part of that was the financial environment that, returns on bonds were so great and interest rates were so high. Why would you lend out when you could just buy bonds and just sit on it and make money? But it seemed like no matter what the interest rate was, and mind you, remember, an SBA loan comes with a secured interest rate because it's backed by the federal government, kind of like a Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac situation. We could not get this loan to close. The restrictions and the barricades that were put up in front of us were just impossible to clear. So we ended up not going and getting the SBA loan, not able to use it for the business the way we wanted to. That's an example of regulation that could be cut, that could let American industry loose in order to produce and grow and thrive. The Trump administration has not done that. Despite the fact of all this talk, there has not been anything in the financial sector outside of crypto that they have deregulated in any meaningful way in order to allow capital to flow into the market, in order to allow for American industry to thrive. Now, a lot of people will say, well, he's trying to put pressure on Jerome Powell to cut interest rates, but there's more to the financial market than just interest rates. Like I said, a lot of it is just regulation and I'm trying to find the right word, but bank restrictions on lending. So opening up some of those floodgates are a regulatory issue more than they are an interest rate issue, because sometimes it doesn't matter what interest rate you want to borrow at, they just won't give you the loan. Similarly, local regulations like infrastructure, building, manufacturing in certain areas just simply aren't going to happen. If you want to build anything in California, it's not going to happen. And the Trump administration hasn't done anything to move in a direction where regulation can be cut in order to allow for more industry to be built. Lastly, I decided to do a little bit of a deep dive and look at the SBA specifically, because the reason I use the SBA as a good example is because the SBA, Small Business Administration, is one of the go-tos for financing, especially for small and middle-class companies in the United States. There's been really no movement at the SBA since Donald Trump came to office, except for the fact that they're cutting their workforce by 43%. Most student loans are going to be migrated from the Department of Education into the SBA, which makes it kind of crazy that they're actually cutting staff by 43% when they're adding to the books. And lastly, the person that's been put in charge of the SBA, some woman who at one point was a senator, she was just a political appointee. She was a Donald Trump supporter. She campaigned with him. She's somewhere from the South. She has no real background to be running this administration. Not that the SBA is a high-tier administration, but she was given this just simply because it was a political appointment. So the person in charge there isn't going to be able to spearhead really aggressive policies that will unleash American industry either. So why I've kind of gone on this tangent, everything I'm seeing out of the Trump administration is showing me that this idea of reshoring is kind of more of a pipe dream, kind of that thing of everyone says at the beginning of the year, if I'm going to lose 30 pounds or whatever their New Year's goal is, rather than a clear set cut goal that we can actually achieve. What I believe is going to be more likely to happen is that this is really more of a punitive measure against countries like China and Europe, and that we're just going to reshuffle the deck of where the bulk of our manufacturing happens. Now, if that leads to reshoring in the United States, which it will in part, because again, invisible hand of the market, great. In one way or another, it will. But I think what the Trump administration is actually doing is trying to position other countries that are not China to be the new manufacturing hubs for the United States, but almost like a vassal state. So what I mean by that, I want to use Vietnam as a subject. So uh, a lot of industry has started moving to Vietnam from around COVID, even a little bit earlier during the Obama administration. This started. There was started to be more and more movement of industry into Vietnam. During COVID, this kind of started to double down because tension with China began to grow. Trump was in office, and people were encouraged to move more manufacturing over to Vietnam. However, the Trump administration still wants to pass a 46% duty on Vietnam, despite the fact that they've removed all of their tariffs from the United States. So, in other words, they're saying, hey, we'll yield to whatever you want, just don't take our industry away. But Trump still wants to levy a 46% tariff. My theory is that the reason he's doing this is he's kind of learned his lesson from China. When we first started exporting to China, it was kind of no restrictions. They were just be able to take all of our business, build as much as they want, no real concessions from the United States. And in fact, a lot of times when a company went and opened a facility there, a member of the Chinese Communist Party or a member of the Chinese people had to be part of the ownership or the management or the board of those countries in those countries. So, for example, Tesla, when they build there, a Chinese representative from the CCP sits with Tesla on the company. So Trump is trying to recreate that magic moment of having cheap manufacturing, but this time having it more strict so that the U.S. isn't put in the same position again in about 20 or 30 years. In other words, these countries can manufacture, they can supply us with cheap goods, but he's not going to allow them to become dominant over the United States again. That's the direction I think he's taking. That's not even so much the direction I think he might be consciously taking, but I think that's the repercussions of the trade policy that we're facing. So, in other words, we're going to have some reshoring. Stuff is going to be built here in the United States. But more importantly, we're going to have tax revenue and we're going to have cheap goods. And we're going to put China on the back foot, as well as any other country that he feels are taking advantage of the United States, like Europe. That's what I think the real trade policy is going to pan out to be, is increased tax revenue through which, yes, we could cut tax here domestically, but we're still going to have cheap goods outside of the U.S., just not based in China. That, I think, is the most likely scenario of the policy shifts I'm seeing. It's not so much reshoring as it is we're just going to be better positioned from a tax base and from a manufacturing and security standpoint. So that was one I kind of wanted to talk about yesterday, but the video was already running long, so I didn't. That's kind of my headline story. That's what I really wanted to get to today. I hope that made sense. Like I often do, I just do this more or less stream of consciousness off of the articles I'm reading, but this was one I kind of thought about, and I hope I didn't sound too confusing with that, but that's just kind of my opinion on what is actually happening with trade policy. So lastly, let me just do rapid fire the stories of the day that I think are interesting. Netflix topped earnings, came in at $10.54 billion versus the $10.52 billion estimated by Wall Street. Not a surprise. Netflix has been doing great for the last couple of quarters. This is a company that I think is without question recession proof. In fact, I think a recession would only help their profit margins. If you can't go out as much, if it's more expensive to go to the movies or out to eat or whatever else, you'll stay in, you'll watch Netflix. And they're not so much worried about subscriber base as they used to be. Now that they have multiple tiers of revenue, they have their premium package, their base level, and their advertising level. So one way or another, they're going to get your money. So I think that this is a great strategy, and it makes complete sense that they're not so much concerned with subscribers as they are with raw profit. So I think this is a great company, really recession-proof. I looked at purchasing it while all the stocks were down, but honestly, it didn't really go down all that much. Next story I want to talk about real quick. Google is hit with another antitrust lawsuit. This one, again, alleging that Google has created a monopoly with advertising. It's very interesting that this is still happening because the first lawsuit came during the Biden administration under Lena Khan. And so I honestly thought that these things would kind of disappear once she left office with the Biden administration. But amazingly, this is a new lawsuit coming up from the states that is kind of doing the same thing. It's very interesting. I completely support it. I do think they are a monopolistic organization. I am still surprised that Apple continues to skirt these kinds of things. It makes no sense to me how they're able to avoid it when they themselves also have a monopoly through the App Store. Yes, it's not through advertising, but they have other avenues in which they have secured themselves in the market and have choked out competition, and they still remain untouched. Another story I want to talk about real quick is Japan. Why I think this is important. I try to stick to American stories, obviously, but in this global market, who can do that anymore? But why I think this story is interesting. So Japan inflation comes in at 3.6%, surpassing the Bank of Japan's target. Why this is important. As we reported on several times in this channel, Japan is continually raising their interest rates. This is the proper response whenever you have inflation. However, what most people don't understand is how heavily Japan is integrated into the United States markets. And traditionally, when they had negative interest rates, the bank was literally paying you to borrow money, which is why you have so much of an influx of Japanese capital into the United States. Things like SoftBank are a great example of that. As interest rates in Japan rise, less of that investment can come to the United States, and it does play a role. Just last year, I've talked about this example multiple times. It was around July, I think it was right around the time that Kamala became the nominee for the Democratic Party. Why I remember this is everybody said that the market freaked out because she was the nominee. It had nothing to do with her. It was entirely because Japan was on a trajectory to raise interest rates, and the market understood that that would prevent an influx of fresh capital into the U.S. financial sector, and that's why there was a major drop. And so stories like this will probably lead to more rises in Japan's base interest rate, which will probably mean less money coming into the United States. Last story I'm going to cover, because again, this is another long video. This one is really interesting. So this one is fascinating, actually. I think this is kind of crazy. So there's a class action lawsuit being waged against Tesla, claiming that Tesla is artificially raising the mileage on their cars in order to get customers out of their warranties quicker. It is a class action lawsuit, but the person bringing this lawsuit says that at times they would be traveling just 20 miles a day, but the system would record 72 miles. Overall, he said that his Model Y was recording at on average, 15% faster than what the mileage was actually showing. And it kicked him out of his warranty quicker than it was supposed to, which 15% is not a small number, resulting in him having to have a suspension repaired outside of warranty. There are now multiple people coming forward with this lawsuit, and they're suing Tesla for millions of dollars. Let's see, right here, Tesla drivers in California, potentially encompassing more than 1 million vehicles, are suing Tesla. Tesla has yet to respond to this claim. I think it's very believable. Car sales are just a shady business all around, as we reported on this channel before. And this is something that is very easy to cheat with on an electric vehicle, simply because so much of it, the updates come through by air. It's very difficult to track. And this could very much end up being true. So another nail potentially on the coffin of Tesla. I think this is a very interesting lawsuit, and we'll see what happens in the next coming weeks, but I can completely believe that it is true. That's pretty much it. Stories of the day, stories of the week. It's Thursday. It's Good Friday tomorrow. We're always off on Friday here anyway. So I'll see you guys back here on Monday. I hope you have a fantastic Easter and have a very productive Friday.